After almost 1,000 years of being asleep and trapped inside a coffin, Rai, the most powerful noble to ever exist, finally wakes up, and upon waking up, he realizes how much the world has changed during his sleep. Everything is different now in the modern-day Japan. Humanity has now grown a lot, and the dominion of his people known as the nobles has basically perished from the world. As before, these powerful beings known as nobles were in a position of power, and once upon a time, they were worshipped by humans and even treated like rulers and sometimes even gods. But that was around about 820 years ago. And here, Rai tries his best to recreate even just a small fraction of what he remembers from his time, to remain faithful to his heritage. But while doing so, he has to try and be a normal student at high school, even though he's actually the most powerful being to ever exist. And at the same time he's being followed by a criminal group who despises the power that the nobles have and the fame they had over humanity. It all begins on a little boat with a group of men from the Union, who find a coffin in the middle of nowhere and take it to an abandoned warehouse. They try for several hours to open the coffin, however no matter what they do, it didn't open, so they all just left it for the night and said they will try again tomorrow. However, on that same night, once the full moon came out, Rai, the most powerful one of his kind, suddenly woke up. The next day, Rai immediately went searching for his assistant named Frankenstein, who was the headmaster of a school at this time. But when Rai arrived, he was met by another student, a guy named Shinwoo, who was late for school and was not allowed to enter the gates. He greets Rai and then asks himself how he's never seen a student with his looks before. But while he's thinking who it is, the gates opened and the boy magically disappeared. Rai went straight to the principal's office, as he could sense where his assistant Frank was in the building. And while Rai stands outside about to knock, Frankenstein already felt his presence and immediately opened the door and knelt down to meet him, calling Rai his master, and welcomes him back to the land of the living. After, Frankenstein tells Rai it's been 820 years and he's been patiently waiting for his return. Rai asks Frank what era they are calling this, and Frank tells him it's the 21st century now, and due to Rai's long sleep, he feels like he needs to be educated on the modern era, so he asks Frankenstein if he can study here. Later on, Rai goes to class, and here the teacher welcomes him and introduces him to the rest of the class. Rai then introduces himself as his full name, Cadis Etram Reisel. After his introduction, Shinwoo shouts out saying this is the boy he saw earlier, but he randomly vanished into thin air. The teacher tells Shinwoo that Rai will be sitting next to him since Shinwoo already knew about him at the start of school. But this makes all the girls stare at Shinwoo out of jealousy. Meanwhile, two of the men from the organization called the Union return back to the abandoned warehouse and find that the coffin has been taken. These two men are known as M21 and M24, and they were the ones in charge of taking the coffin. However, upon arriving, it's no longer there, and they were both angry at the watchman who was looking after the coffin. They thought the man was lying about the coffin's whereabouts, however, to see if he's telling the truth or not. M24 bites the man's neck, and this reveals parts of the watchman's memories, and inside his head he can see a female witness in his memory, and used it to track her down and find the woman so they can get the answers they were looking for. After the watchman, who is bit by M24, has transformed into some kind of monster and who now works for the organization. After, back in school, Rai was in the canteen area with Shinwoo, with all the girls who are staring at him. And here, Shinwoo is so surprised that Rai doesn't even know what ramen noodles are, and has never heard of any of these popular Japanese dishes before. So Shinwoo helps him understand it all and also taste the food. But inside Rai's head, he thinks it's poison or maybe a trap, but after tasting it, it becomes his favorite dish. On their way home from school, Rai is walking with Shinwoo and Ikan, and they hear screams coming from under the highway roads, and here we see a student named Yana getting attacked by the monster who was bitten by M24. The monster had tracked down Yuna as she was the witness in the dreams before the coffin was taken. So Shinwoo quickly ran up to the monster like an absolute maniac and drop-kicked him in the face like Bruce Lee, and knocking the monster into the ground, and saving his friend Yuna. At this moment the others see the monster get back up and get scared, and they all quickly run away. However, Rai didn't even care about the monster and stood perfectly still. His eyes began to light up red and he could sense something around the corner, and it was M21 and M24 who were hiding. After, they both realize that there's something different about Rai, as he doesn't seem like an ordinary guy, and they have no idea that he was the one who came out of the coffin that they're searching for. After running away, they find a safe spot in the park. And after, M21 and M24 are seen in the alleyway with the monster they created, and they decide that following Yuna is still the best plan of action, as she's the only one who saw what happened and what came out of the coffin that night. While they talk, we learn that these two are working with others in an organization called the Union, and this organization does a lot of shady things, like experiments on humans in order to try and create people with powers, just like M21 and M24. And as a result, M24 is now some kind of vampire with super strength and M21 is a werewolf demon. Here we meet two other people from the sketchy organization group, named Jake and Mary, who are M21 and M24's superiors, and they tell them that they must find the coffin as soon as possible, otherwise they will be eliminated, as they are only subordinates created by the organization, and they are treated like worthless scumbags. We see in a flashback at the organization headquarters where M21 and M24 were created, and they received orders to retrieve the coffin, as Jake knew that the powerful noble was inside it. But after learning about the power within inside the coffin, M21 and M24 were going to take the power from the coffin and use it against the organization for revenge on what they did to them and the others in the lab, where they treated them like disgusting little lab rats. After a few days of searching for the coffin, M21 and M24 saw Rai and his classmates again, and while looking down from the highest building in the city, M21 is shocked when Rai stares at them all the way from the ground and they lock eyes. Right then, their other colleagues Jake and Mary arrive at the top of the building, and Jake devises a plan to eliminate Shinwoo and his classmates, as they are the only witnesses to what happens in the organization, and no one can know these monsters and experiments exist other than members inside the organization. While on their way home, Shinwoo and his friends get approached by the organization, and here, Jake appears and they are also attacked by M21. Jake is impressed by M21's fighting skills, but M21 tells Jake that one of their classmates is still missing and he's the one they need to capture the most. However, Rai was sitting with his assistant Frank, and while they were talking, Frank receives a call, and it was from Shinwoo's number, but it was a message sent by Jake as he's got their students captured at the warehouse. On the other hand, the monster was just about to eat his classmates. However, Shinwoo got up just in time to save them, and they make a run for it. Meanwhile, Rai and Frankenstein head out to search for Shinwoo and the others, and although the message wasn't clear, Frankenstein knew something was wrong and must find them before something happens to his students. While Rai and Frank fly to the destination, we see Shinwoo, Ikan and Yuna running into the elevator, and Jake starts getting angry and kills the monster that was created by M24 as he was useless and starts to take matters into his own hands. When Jake gets to the elevator, he grabs Shinwoo and they start fighting. However, due to Jake being a highly modified human with strengths in all areas, Shinwoo didn't stand a chance, as he's just an ordinary student. But he still tried his best to defeat Jake on his own. On the other hand, M24 is standing in the background as Shinwoo begs Jake to not harm his friends, and Shinwoo tells Jake he won't let him do it. And this was heard by M24, who remembers what Jake did to him and his friends in the organization headquarters. So M24 could not stand by and watch Jake do this again, and so he steps up to Jake and punches him with the most impressive blow to the jaw. And at this moment, M24 officially went rogue. M21 immediately found out about this, as they were on the same signal using an earpiece, and after hearing what M24 just did, Mary suddenly attacked M21 and they get into a huge fight. At this time, Jake gets back up and instantly attacks M24, but while M24 is weaker than Jake, he still manages to get a hold of Jake and blows himself up. Meanwhile, M21 is still fighting Mary and is pretty useless against her, and she performs several insane moves and overpowers M21 while calling him a dumb little bitch, and also insults his friend M24 at the same time, calling them both failed experiments and ugly worthless orphans. While roasting M21, she was just about to finish him off. However, this is when Frankenstein suddenly appears and grabs hold of Mary just in time, and Rai also follows right behind him. After M21 saw Rai again, he felt a strange feeling once again and knew something was different about him. After, Frankenstein asks Marie where the students are, but Marie tells them that they can't save them as Jake has captured them and they are already too late. But just at that moment, M21 thinks that Rai might be able to save M24 if he gets there in time. So he tells Rai the location, and after he warns Frank and Rai to get out of here, as he wants to face Marie again. But Rai doesn't allow M21 to fight, as he knows M21 will lose, and instead he orders Frank to take care of Mary, and he wants M21 to guide him to the location of Shinwoo and the others. A few minutes after the explosion, Jake got up, but M24 is nowhere to be seen. Right then, Jake confronts Shinwoo again and calls him a weak, disgusting mortal human and tells Shinwoo he loves killing low-life trash like him. But just as Jake was about to end them off, Rai arrives, and Jake remembers about the last student who was not there when they met Shinwoo. Then all of a sudden, M21 screams and attacks Jake with all his might. But once again, Jake is much stronger, so M21 just gets beat by the opponent. Right then, the scene changes to Marie and Frankenstein, and here we see Marie, who witnesses how strong Frank is, and for the first time in years she is forced to transform into her true form due to the strength of Frank and his noble powers, which shocked the enemy. After seeing Mary's true form, this gives Frankenstein doubts of being victorious. However, just then, Rai gives Frankenstein permission to break his seal for the first time, and this unlocks his full potential as a noble, and we see him gain an immense amount of power, and Marie instantly gets scared of him and couldn't believe what was happening. After this, Frankenstein roasts Marie, saying that the whole organization started with the nobles, as they are just trying to copy what the nobles did, wanting to become gods like them. But Frank said they are just pathetic regular humans with lab rat powers and could never truly rule over the humans, as they just have evil intentions. And then he suddenly attacks her with a super energy blast which erupts the whole building and shatters the glass all around it, and Marie couldn't do anything about it. Meanwhile, Jake defeats M21 as M21 is too weak to fight on, and this leaves only Rai as the last one there. Jake approaches Rai and thinks that Rai is terrified of him since Rai doesn't even look into Jake's eyes, and Jake laughs at how scared he is. Jake keeps laughing and mocks Rai, calling him many names, and tells Rai to kneel. However, Rai doesn't say a word and then uses his OP abilities and can make Jake kneel before him like his little bit. And Rai didn't even have to lay a finger on him. After seeing this kind of power, M21 is shocked and realizes that he must be the one that the organization were talking about the whole time, and who must be the hidden power in the coffin known as Noblesse. After making Jake look like a little b*** in front of everyone, he tries getting up again. But every time he tries, Rai just smashes his head onto the floor with his mind control. After, Shinwoo tries to call out to Rai, warning him to watch out. But Rai doesn't want them to know who he really is and what he's capable of, so he puts them to sleep with the mind control, and just then, Jake finally transforms into his lab rat experimentation form, and we get to see the monster hidden inside him for the first time. And Jake turns into a massive demonic beast monster with insane amount of strength and a being which was made to take care of major problems like Rai. However, even after this transformation, Jake still can't even touch Rai, and Rai makes him kneel again, even when Jake is in his demonic monster form. Jake then tries one last time and gathers all his strength to generate a massive swing at Rai. But Rai simply blocks it a few inches away from his face, and Jake still hasn't made any physical contact towards Rai, no matter how powerful he gets. After seeing Jake's attempts to kill Rai, Rai now takes matters into his own hands and tells Jake that he will pay for all his sins with his own blood. And just then Rai destroys Jake and blasts him into a billion pieces, and the whole building pours down red and he gets completely erased from the universe like he was nothing at all. Meanwhile, in the middle of nowhere, an army of armed men were attacked by a group of assailants called the DA5, who belonged to a group known as the Union, or otherwise known as the Organization. The DA5 assailants, Tao, Takio, Shark, Hammer, and their leader, Kranz, were easily able to wipe out all of the armed forces using their abnormal strength, and were successful in capturing a senior scientist. As the task was successfully completed, the DA5 decided to head to Japan for their next task from the Union. Meanwhile, somewhere in Japan, two high schoolers, Shinwoo, also known as Toshiro, and his best friend Iken, or Manabu Case, return back to high school. They are greeted with a flock of girls surrounding the newly appointed security guard of the school, who is M21. From far away, our main protagonist Rai is reassured by his servant Frankenstein, also known as Frank, about Toshiro's memory being overwritten, since Toshiro previously knew that M21 was a superhuman. The night before, M21 got a job as a security guard because he used to be part of the Union. But they were after him and his friend M24 because they had special powers, and the Union considered them failed experiments. So, M21 had to keep a low profile. Now, in the current time, Frank, who is also the school chairman, lets his master Rai pretend to be a high school student even though he is the noblesse. Rai wants to catch up on the technology that has advanced in the last 820 years. When Rai enters the classroom, he quickly becomes friends with Toshiro and doodles a cat face on his bandage. During lunch, Rai is amazed by smartphones, seeing students take pictures and talk from a distance. At recess, Rai talks to Frank and M21, expressing his desire to have a phone like everyone else. The next day, Toshiro and Manabu are surprised to see Rai with the newest and best smartphone. During lunch, a big guy in a fancy car shows up and starts picking fights with students in the sports area, looking for Toshiro. When they hear the noise, Toshiro, Rai, Manabu, and other students rush over. M21, watching from a distance, hesitates to get involved because he needs to keep a low profile. After a while, an older janitor tries to step in, but the big guy gets angry and prepares to throw a punch. Toshiro jumps in to protect the janitor, using his bandage to block the punch. The big guy recognizes Toshiro and says he's been looking for him, claiming Toshiro made a move on his girlfriend. Toshiro kept trying to explain that his girlfriend misunderstood, but the big guy was determined to beat him up. With no other option, Toshiro had to fight back, and the big guy landed a few punches before Toshiro managed to land an uppercut. Just as things were escalating, Rai had to step in and make M21 intervene. M21 quickly appeared before the big guy and easily subdued him. Frightened, the big guy told his friends to back off, hurriedly reversing his sports car to get away. Later that day, Frank apologized to M21 for unintentionally putting him in the spotlight when his goal was to lay low. Meanwhile, in Japan, the DA5, the group of attackers from earlier, stood on a skyscraper, scanning the surroundings before putting their plans into action. The next day, as M21 is about to close the school gates, two white-haired students approach him. They instruct M21 to lead them to Frank, the headmaster. Realizing that they are nobles, Frank tries to act as a normal human and enrolls them into the high school. However, he tips off Rai about the new students who are namely Regis and Sarah. As they entered their new classroom, Regis pissed his pants when he sensed a demonizing aura from Rai. And so, he decided to linger with him a little longer. At the cafeteria, Regis finds Rai intriguing. Toshiro notices Manabu crushing over Sarah and shares his plan with Rai to get them together. Meanwhile, Frank and M21 drive back towards home. On the way, M21 inquires with Frank about the nobles who were powerful beings and were sought after by the Union. Unlike the Union that used scientific methods to draw out power in humans, the nobles had innate strength. Frank adds that many centuries ago, the nobles appeared in humanity's dire time of need, and the nobles devoted themselves to protect the human race as they were comparatively stronger and possessed unique powers. For this very reason, Frank speculates that Regis avoided fighting him because Regis assumed that he was an ordinary human. M21 scoffs at the ideology of the nobles, but Frank assures him that some nobles have a different line of thinking. They believe that as society has progressed, the humans no longer need a superior race looking after them. M21 inquires if Rai and Frank were nobles, and Frank ambiguously informs him that he was correct yet incorrect at the same time. Reaching home, Frank is unamused to find Regis, Sarah and Rai, along with his friends, clowning around his house. Unable to hide his emotions, he escapes to the kitchen to wash the dishes. Seeing that M21 was living with Frank, Toshiro suggests Frank to also let Regis and Sarah stay at his house. Frank hesitantly accepts as his master. Rai allows the two of them to stay. Returning to the kitchen, Frank apologizes to M21 for bringing in more company when he wanted to stay low. M21 humbly thanks Frank for all he had done and lends a hand in washing the dishes. Sarah enters the room to offer her help, but Frank assures her that he had it under control. As she was leaving, Sarah noticed the number 21 tattooed on M21's hand. The next day, she informs Regis of the tattoo and speculates that M21 was an experimental subject of the Union, as the Union numbered their subjects. Believing that the disappearance of the nobless's casket was linked to M21's sudden appearance, Regis decides to trail M21. Confronting M21, Regis inquires him of his knowledge about the events surrounding the disappearance of the casket. M21 tries to lie about his involvement, but Regis does not buy his lies and urges M21 to reveal the perpetrators behind the casket's disappearance. Believing that Regis was unaware that the noblesse was already out, M21 tries to reveal insufficient information. Fed up, Regis decides to use mind control, but M21 evades it and weaponizes his hands into claws. As they are fighting, Regis is informed by Sarah about her troubled situation. A few moments prior, Toshiro, Manabu, Rai and Sarah were heading back home. Toshiro tried to get Manabu close to Sarah, but was suddenly met with a group of strange men. They asked Toshiro to oblige with their orders as they held a knife against Rai. Hearing this, Regis and M21 head towards Toshiro and find him fighting against a mob. Regis tries to intervene, but M21 stops him, informing him that Sarah was safe. Moreover, he tells Regis that humans are not as weak as they used to be. As the mob leader pulls out a gun, M21 safeguards Toshiro. The mob, having lost the fight, leave Toshiro and his friends alone. As they head back home at night, M21 informs Regis that humans do not need the leadership of the nobles, and that humans are now more independent than they were centuries ago. Although they continue to have a little friction, Regis and M21 make up for the fight before. As they reach home, Regis informs M21 that he would keep an eye on him for the time being. Moreover, still believing that Frank was an ordinary human, Regis uses mind control to make Frank quote-unquote forget the discussion he had with M21. To make Regis believe it had worked, Frank acts like he was being mind controlled. Furthermore, Regis also uses his powers on Rai, but is unsure if his power even works on Rai due to Rai's expressionless personality. Somewhere else, the DA5 from the Union are investigating the casket disappearance, and according to Tao of the DA5, the event surrounding the disappearance was ironically covered up as a psycho rampage by the police, despite it being evidently caused by superhuman people. Moreover, since Jack and Marie, the superior superhuman models, were sent to investigate the casket before them, they assumed Jack and Marie were still looking for the missing casket since they hadn't reported back about an infectee M21 and M24 had created. Moreover, after finding nothing about M21's and M24's current status, they assume they both are alive and they begin to search for them. Meanwhile, back at the high school, Manabu scolds Toshiro for getting into fights oftenly, and he starts to cling to Regis, making Toshiro believe that he had something for men instead of women. At Manabu's home, Manabu, being a computer geek, is tasked by his uncle, who is in the police, to carry out security checks on the police department server. During the security check, Manabu encounters Tao of the DA5, who was trying to hack into the police department server. They both gradually started to gain respect for each other since they hadn't found anyone as nerdy as they were, and they continued to outdo each other by sending attacks over the server back and forth. During the intense battle, brainless Toshiro spoils the fun as he accidentally trips on the laptop battery cord, causing Manabu's laptop to shut down. Manabu scolds Toshiro for not using his brain and leaves the room to report the server attack to his uncle. With Manabu out of the room, Toshiro takes control of Manabu's laptop and begins to read Manabu's chats. Tao, impressed with Manabu's skills, begins to chat with Manabu, not knowing that now Toshiro was behind the laptop. Toshiro begins to feel suspicious as Tao reveals he is a 24-year-old man, making Toshiro believe even more that Manabu was into guys, and even old ones on that. As Toshiro was busy chatting, Manabu creeps up on Toshiro with a godlike coldness in his eyes, which makes Toshiro gulp in fear as he begs for mercy. Meanwhile, Tao, after feeling that Manabu is being unresponsive, reports to Kranz, the leader of the DA5, about M21's whereabouts, as Tao was able to spot him through hacking the city cameras. After hearing the report, Kranz orders Hammer and Shark to apprehend M21 using any techniques they could in order to apprehend him alive. Meanwhile, at Frank's house, M21 and Regis continued to argue with each other, and finally, after a while, as M21 was about to open up about his past to Regis, M21 is interrupted by Frank, who finally loses his cool as he orders Regis and M21 to clean up all the wrappers they had thrown onto the floor. Regis, being the annoying brat he is, orders Frank to make Rai also participate in cleaning the floor. Frank, hesitant to ask his master to clean, begins to divert the conversation onto Sarah, but Regis again brings the topic back onto Rai. Annoyed with Regis's squealing, Rai, with zero expression, stands up and begins to help Regis clean up the mess. The next day, Frank gives a fake bank account to M21 that couldn't be traced by the union and deposits his first salary on the bank account. The following day, on his way to someplace, M21 encounters Shark and Hammer, who immediately start off on bad terms. Shortly after, a battle ensues which ends up totally one-sided as Shark is easily able to outskill M21. After a while, the fight is interrupted with Regis and Sarah stumbling upon M21 totally injured. Provoked by Regis badmouthing him, Shark unleashes a strong attack towards Regis, which is blocked by M21, who stands in front of Regis and absorbs the attack. Shortly after, Kranz jumps in and scolds Shark for going overboard on M21, even though he had instructed him to bring him alive. To protect Regis and Sarah and to also find out about his previous comrades, M21 agrees to come along with the DA5 as he acted to be a part of the union since the DA5 still believed him to be a union agent. Regis also buys into M21's act of a union agent and feels furious as he feels betrayed by him. Meanwhile, Manabu once again gets to security check police servers, and this time returns prepared to counter Tao's breach on the police server. As expected, Tao once again appears and he sends a barrage of viruses to Tao's device, taking him by surprise. Tao, impressed by Manabu's attack, traces Manabu's data and finds his whereabouts, and decides to pay him a visit sometime soon to befriend him. Back to Regis, reaching Frank's mansion, Regis and Sarah inform Frank of M21's betrayal, making Frank worried that M21 would leak Rai's information to the Union after joining them. Somewhere secluded, the DA5 members detain and torture M21 in an attempt to pry out information about his mission regarding the retrieval of the casket, and also about Jake and Marie. Since M21 wasn't budging, the DA5 decide to leave him for the time being and give him some time to think. Before leaving, Takeo sympathizes with M21's condition and offers him water, which surprises M21 and the other DA5 members. After drinking the water, M21, using the DA5's false knowledge of him still being a union agent, agrees to cooperate, and he only promises to reveal information on the condition that the DA5 members reveal to him about the data on his fellow failed experiments like himself. After accepting his deal, M21 takes further advantage of being the only lead to their case and bargains for food. Kranz asks Hammer to share his greasy knockoff McDonald's broast, but M21 demands them for a bowl of ramen instead. Taking a break, Tao commends Takeo's humane ways of doing things in his group as he was the only one who sympathized with M21. But Takeo informs his kind nature being a result of his memories with his sister. At school, Manabu wonders about M21's sudden disappearance and asks Regis about M21. Seeing that Regis was mad for some reason, Manabu plans to have a party at Frank's mansion. Shortly after, Manabu receives a text from Tao asking for a physical meetup tomorrow, so the next day, he leaves Toshiro alone with Sarah to buy party items. The next day, as Toshiro is carrying the party items, he notices Takeo getting beaten up in an alleyway and springs into action to beat up the bullies. Somewhere else, Manabu meets up with Tao and is initially on guard as Tao was an outlaw hacker who had hacked the police department. But soon they geek out over their shared interest in hacking. Manabu finds that he and Tao are a lot alike as they are surrounded by people that do not understand their similar hobby. As a sign of respect, Manabu calls Tao his older brother, which makes Tao happy. After rescuing him from the alleyway, Takeo thanks Toshiro for helping him and mistakes Sarah and him for a couple. Rushing to reach the mansion in time for the party, Toshiro and Sarah part ways with Takeo, who was reminded of his younger sister who was also their age. Later, to understand what it means to be an older brother, Tao offers Takeo a hand in searching for his sister who was detained by the Union. After the long break, Shark threatens to kill M21 if he remains silent during the interrogation once again. But Takeo reminds Shark that M21 was their only source of info. Chastising his forgiving nature, Shark reveals that he had killed all of the women and children that Takeo had spared in the previous missions. Hearing this, Takeo is enraged and points his gun at Shark. But Tao stops him. Shark asks him to discard his pity as the organization had a rule to kill any possible leakers. Later that day, at the high school, Regis notices Shark who was watching him from afar. Shark, realizing that Regis had previously seen him, decides to use him as a pawn to pry out information from M21. Later, Regis meets up with Shark and Hammer and a battle ensues. Regis easily proceeds to outclass Shark, so Hammer throws out bombs to protect Shark. He then tosses Shark a pill called D, which turns Shark more stronger than before. Able to keep up with him now, Regis decides to use his powers at full potential and impales Shark. Before landing a finishing blow on Shark, Regis stops as Hammer threatens to kill Manabu and Toshiro if he does not oblige with their orders. Back at the base, Shark meets up with the other DA5 members and M21 and reveals his new captives. At Frank's mansion, Sarah takes her leave in a hurry after she sensed her mental connection with Regis was destroyed, meaning that Regis was either unconscious or dead. Believing that Manabu and Toshiro were also in danger, Rai and Frank follow after Sarah. Unconscious Regis finally awakens to find himself in strong handcuffs and surrounded by DA5 members. Believing that Regis knew about the casket, Shark tries to pry his relation with M21. To save Regis, M21 lies about Regis's relation with him. Toshiro and Manabu also awaken and realize that they had met some of the members previously. Toshiro is surprised to see Takeo, whereas Tao is ridiculed by Shark after Manabu calls Tao his older brother. However, neither of them expected to find their school guard, M21, among the members. M21 ignores Manabu's cries for an explanation, so Shark tests M21's conviction by threatening to beat up Toshiro to death. Before anything could go down, Tao intervenes and Takeo suggests that they let the new captives go after they use a memory-erasing drug. However, Kran supports Shark's decision to kill them as any potential risks were not acceptable. As Shark advances to impale Manabu, Toshiro tries to slow Shark down. Seeing that M21's humanity was far gone, Regis takes matters in his own hands and protects Manabu. Shark then strikes Regis to the ground and then lifts him up to land a barrage of punches on his face. To protect Regis, Toshiro rushes to punch Shark. Meanwhile, returning with the whole KFC menu, Hammer finds Sarah on his way back to the interrogation room. Hammer throws bombs at her, but Sarah cuts his body. He then throws another set of bombs, but Sarah makes quick work of him. Receiving the punch, Shark lets go of Regis so he could deal with Toshiro. Takeo protests against Shark's actions, but Kran sends Takeo away to investigate the bombings in the above floors of the building. M21 tries to set Toshiro and the other students free by agreeing to reveal information, but Kranz refuses to leave witnesses behind. Shark then lifts Toshiro by the neck so he could choke him to death as M21 begins to question his decisions. M21 was very close to fulfilling his promise with M24 by finding other failed experiments, but now he was in a dilemma. Manabu rushes to help but is hurled away by Shark. Realizing that he was discarding his morality, M21 makes the decision to help Toshiro by clawing away at Shark's arm. At the roof of the building, Rai and Frank land only to find Takeo in front of them. Frank suggests Rai to help his friends while he deals with Takeo. Frank charges at Takeo, who blocks the attack using a black box. Takeo then begins shooting Frank using a huge rifle. Frank dodges the shots and gets close range, only to realize that Takeo also had a pistol at his disposal. Frank saves himself in time, so Takeo decides to use the D-pill to speed things up. On another floor, Sarah once again finds Hammer, who had survived the previous attack and was now under the influence of the D-pill. Meanwhile, M21 continues charging against Shark, who then pushes him away. To protect the students, M21 comes in front of Shark's attack, making him fall to the ground. Realizing that M21 was now on his side, Regis breaks his handcuffs and throws Shark away. Shark then uses the D-pill to power up, but Regis is still able to corner him. Before Regis could behead him, Kranz saves Shark and uses the D-pill himself. Mistaken that Kranz was trying to help him, Shark is shocked to find himself impaled by Kranz, who reveals his motive of absorbing the other members using the pill. After reducing Shark to skin and bones, Kranz throws Shark away and easily counters all advances from Regis. He then punches Regis, but decides to spare him as Regis had information on the casket. Seeing Regis's state, M21 tries to help, but bleeds due to the cut from earlier. With less to no hope, M21 finds Rai nearby, making his way inside the room, with his target, Kranz, in sight. Rai is pissed off and gets offended after Kranz speaks without permission in his presence. He forces Kranz to the ground using mind control. Meanwhile, Takeo places his pistol point blank at Frank. Takeo tries to finish Frank quickly as he needs to deal with Rai next. Hearing this, Frank unleashes his sealed powers to protect his master. At the same time, Sarah summons her soul weapon, which was known as the Death Scythe. She decapitates Hammer and heads out, only to see a flashy battle taking place on the roof. At the roof, Takeo tries to evade Frank's spikes, but is eventually caught. As Takeo was preparing to accept his sealed fate, a glimmer of his sister's face forced him to struggle for survival. Takeo then leaps and fires a shot at Frank, which nearly hits Frank's face. Takeo rushes behind Frank, but Frank is able to immobilize him. Takeo falls to the ground, and Frank advances to finish him off. However, Sarah reaches the rooftop and realizes that Frank was no ordinary human and was only acting as one. Likewise, Frank realizes that Sarah is a noble clan leader due to her possessing a soul weapon. Recognizing Sarah from before, Takeo asks Sarah to protect Toshiro as he had saved him in the alleyway previously. Frank spares Takeo, instructing him to apologize to Toshiro after they clear up the interrogation room. Back in the interrogation room, Kranz resists the mind control imposed by Rai and tries to slash him. Rai stops his attack single-handedly and blasts him away to the wall. Kranz sends many slashes towards Rai, who deflects it using his barrier. Desperate, Kranz orders Tao to consume the D-pill, so Tao obliges and heads towards Kranz against Manabu's protests. Kranz lifts him by the neck and demands him to hurry, but is taken off guard as Tao leaps away from his grip and shocks him with a taser. Angered by his betrayal, Kranz charges to finish off Tao. However, Rai paralyzes Kranz with his power, allowing Tao to escape. Hearing Manabu's pleas, Rai heads towards Manabu, reminding him that he would protect them regardless because they are friends. Rai then breaks into a Hitler salute, allowing him to manipulate blood. Regis recognizes this ability to be blood-field, which makes him astounded by Rai's sheer power. Rai finds it fitting to eradicate Kranz by his own blood spilled from the battle. Unable to keep up, Kranz is erased from existence, concluding the fight once and for all. The next day, at Frank's mansion, Takeo awakens from his unconsciousness, only to find M21 in bandages next to him. In another room, Frank notices Rai coughing blood due to the exertion from the previous battle. Before he could help Rai tells him to not worry about him and he should really be ashamed of being selfish and breaking his seal without permission. Reminded of breaking his seal, Frank apologizes to Rai as he had sealed Frank's powers previously, and he was not to use his sealed powers without Rai's consent. Frank, prepared to take on any punishments from Rai, was surprised as Rai dropped all punishments as he trusted that Frank was wise in his decisions and would not disobey Rai unreasonably. Hungry, Rai and Frank head to the dinner table where Tao is impressed by Sarah's cooking skills, but is even more amazed by Frank's signature ramen dish. At the mansion's balcony, M21 regrets failing to get intel on his fellow failed experiments and starts blaming his failure on his weakness. However, Rai informs M21 that he had more potential and proceeds to show him his powerful true form. Overwhelmed by his own powers, M21 vows to get stronger. In another room, Tao and Takeo decide to hide from the Union by hacking its server and listing themselves as dead. Worried about his sister, Takeo gets the shock of his life after Tao informs him that his sister did not exist, and his memories with her fabricated by the Union. Feeling like a burden to Frank, Tao decides to leave with Takeo the next day. As they are leaving, Tao also informs M21 that he attempted to extract info about other failed experiments, but all records were already destroyed. M21, feeling that the Union will continue to track them down, begs Frank to lend them a place in the mansion. Upon Rai's agreement, Frank lets Takeo and Tao also stay at the mansion, making it more of a shelter than a mansion now. The next day, Toshiro and Manabu decide to continue their high school after a long break and find themselves with an even bigger flock of perverted girls since the handsome trio of two newly assigned guards, consisting of Tao and Takeo along with M21, had all the girls drooling. Moreover, all of the girls go crazy when the Riz Lord himself, Rai, makes his entry, which causes Toshiro to get depressed since he had zero luck with getting a waifu. During lunch break, since Toshiro was gloomy about his unfair life without girls, Manabu asks Rai for help since he was the charm of the high school. Rai only stutters a word which causes all the girls around him to go faint, which backfires since Toshiro gets even more annoyed and desperate. To help Toshiro's dire situation, Manabu asks which girl he had a crush on, and it unfortunately turns out to be Sarah, the only girl which was as beautiful and as emotionless as Rai. With a code red-like situation in hand, Manabu gathers Takeo, Tao, M21 and Rai to somewhere secluded. To get help with Toshiro's love life, Manabu begs them to help Toshiro since they all had huge success with girls, and he reveals that Toshiro was going straight for the big fish, Sarah. Knowing that getting Toshiro with Sarah was straight up mission impossible, Tao, Takeo and M21 try to excuse themselves out of the spot, but they are forced to help since Rai asks them to help him out. After a lot of tries, Toshiro is unable to synergize with Tao, Takeo and M21 and helplessly decides to visit Frank. At the headmaster room, Toshiro asks Frank if he ever had problems with girls, and to Toshiro's surprise, Frank replies with yes. As Frank begins to tell his story, Toshiro quickly realizes that Frank did have trouble with girls, but it was trouble involving getting rid of girls chasing him around every time since he was handsome AF. With a few people to get help from, Toshiro decides to meet up with Regis since he was the only one who used to hang around Sarah all the time. Since Regis and Sarah were on formal terms, Regis isn't able to help Toshiro, which follows up with M21 calling Regis useless since he wasn't helpful. Regis and M21 quickly get into an argument like always, and as a result, Regis decides to not help Toshiro. Before Regis was about to leave, Rai appears behind Regis and orders him to help Toshiro. After a while, at the library, Regis, Tao, Takeo and M21 help Toshiro write a love letter, but it is all in vain since Toshiro is unable to write a letter without being too formal or too weird. Toshiro, annoyed, discards the paper he was writing on and throws it away, which coincidentally lands near Rai's shoe. In an attempt to impress Sarah, Toshiro formulates a plan to impress Sarah by showing off his basketball skills to her. To help Toshiro look cool, Tao, Takeo, M21 and Regis agree to play like noobs and let Toshiro take the crown. As the basketball match begins, Rai coincidentally gets control of the ball, and since Rai had a powerful aura emanating from him, nobody dared to get close. Since Rai, alien to basketball rules, started to travel with ball in hand, he is forced to give away the possession of the ball because of the traveling rule. The game is started once again, and the ball once again coincidentally directs towards Rai, who this time gracefully dodges the ball and lets it get in the possession of the opposing team. Regis, now with the ball in hand, gets selfish as he strays away from the plan and gets into a rivalry with M21. M21 and Regis start to play against each other as they try to outdo each other by getting more hoops than the other. After a while, the ball directs towards Rai and he gets possession of the ball once again. To help Toshiro, Rai passes the ball to Toshiro at full speed and he makes the ball go through M21's block so that Toshiro could gain control of the ball. With the only chance in proving himself cool to girls present at the court, Toshiro jumps up to slam dunk the ball, but his one and only chance is ruined by Takeo, who also forgets his motive and proceeds to snatch the ball and score a hoop himself, causing the girls to fall for him instead. Hopeless, Toshiro and Manabu sit outside at a bench where Toshiro decides to stop chasing after Sarah as he felt that Sarah had no feelings for him. Shortly after, Sarah and Regis approach them from behind where Sarah reveals the love letter Toshiro had discarded before. Toshiro, feeling all embarrassed, asks if she had read through the love letter. Sarah, after confirming that she had read through the letter, tells Toshiro to be himself since he is much charming when he is truer to himself and others. Since they were headed to Frank's house, Sarah hands over Toshiro's bag to him and smiles for the very first time as they all together headed towards Frank's mansion. After reaching the mansion, Manabu and Toshiro find everyone sitting down formally as they all were waiting for the two of them to arrive. Upon arriving, Frank reveals that Rai was going to rewrite their memories of them since they knew who nobles and superhumans were. Manabu and Toshiro break down as they protest, but they finally agree after Frank reveals that rewriting their memories was necessary for their own safety since the secret of nobles and superhumans was to remain secret. Rai, reassuring that Manabu and Toshiro wouldn't lose their feelings and relation with them, rewrites their memories by making them forget about them being nobles and superhumans. The next day, Jejuval K. Landigger, the noble clan leader of the Landigger clan, pays a visit to the academy. All the nobles in the academy sense Jejuval's presence, and Regis and Sarah bow while greeting him as Regis belonged to the Landigger clan. Jejuval questions Regis's duties as he was apparently wasting his time mingling with modified humans. Before Regis could answer, their conversation is cut short as Frank, having history with Jejuval, greets him at the gate and invites him to his mansion. Meanwhile, in the country of nobles called Lucadonia, the current lord of the nobles, Raskrea, holds a meeting to inform other noble clan leaders about Jejuval's departure to Japan. Some nobles point out that Regis and Sarah, who were tasked with the casket's retrieval, have been silent for a while. This leads them to believe that they are intentionally silent as they are possibly colluding with the noblesse, Rai, who many believed was a traitor since he supposedly betrayed the previous lord, who was also the current lord, Raskrea's father. After the meeting, Carius believes that the speculations about Regis and Sarah are overly presumptuous, whereas Rajak is still open to the possibility of betrayal. Rail, Rajak's younger brother, overhears Sarah's name in the conversation and pipes in. Rajak, being the current leader of the Kersha clan, reminds his brother of his low status and proceeds to ignore him. Meanwhile, at Frank's mansion, Jejuval meets Rai and reveals that since eternal sleep was synonymous with death, many believed Rai to be a traitor for leaving the previous lord to his death even though he was on an eternal sleep. Since many other noble clan leaders also entered eternal sleep with the previous lord, the gap between the previous nobles and the current nobles was huge since the gaps were filled in desperately, which left Lucadonia, the country of nobles, quite vulnerable. To regain its lost strength, Jejuval invites Rai to return to Lucadonia as he promised to prove his innocence if he was willing to follow him to Lucadonia. Grown close to humans, Rai decides to linger around his high school for a bit longer and tells Jejuval to wait for a while. Meanwhile, Regis and Sarah explain everything about clan leaders and nobility to M21, Tao and Takio since they were superhumans and knew nothing about the nobles. Sarah reveals that she was the leader of the Loyard clan. Furthermore, Regis reveals that Jejuval was his grandfather, which was apparent by the similar patch of black hair in between their white hair. Meanwhile, at Frank's mansion, since Rai was going to stay for a bit longer, Jejuval decides to stay at Frank's mansion, and instead of thanking Frank for his hospitality, Jejuval bluntly tells Frank that he doesn't trust him since Frank was a noble killer 820 years ago and was involved in slaughtering hundreds of nobles. Reminded of his past, Frank gets a flashback of his brutal ways of killing nobles 820 years ago. Since humans were looked down upon by nobles, Frank used to kill nobles in an attempt to make the nobles feel the same way humans did, thus he gained the title of Noble Hunter. Following the events of 820 years ago, to get rid of the arising Noble Hunter, the previous lord had assigned Jejuval and Rager, the leader of the Kersha clan at the time, to apprehend Frank alive. After receiving the lord's command, on a quiet night, Jejuval and Rager, along with the Order of the Knights, consisting of noble agents, storm into Frank's residence. Frank, knowing that his hideout was compromised, started to flee, but shortly after, he gets cornered by a cliff. With nowhere to run, Frank unleashed his powers and knocked the army of men instantly. As Frank was done with the agents, Jejuval and Rager immediately followed up and prevented Frank from escaping. Frank, in no mood to cooperate, immediately starts a fight with Rager. After a while, Rager tells Jejuval to stand back as he unsheathes Kadis, his soul weapon, which is a supernatural weapon that can be freely summoned by the noble clan leaders and the lord. Upon seeing Rager unsheath his soul weapon, Frank summons clouds all over the sky which start to produce purple electricity. The purple electricity strikes Frank's hand and in an instant summons him Dark Spear, his weapon. Frank, after touching swords with Rager, starts to lose control over his body as the Dark Spear starts to corrupt his soul. Jejuval, sensing that the situation had escalated, decides to discard his honor as he joins to help Rager 2v1ing against Frank. To end the battle, Jejuval also unsheathes his soul weapon and they all strike at once, causing a huge blast to occur. As the smoke due to the blast died down, Frank had already disappeared with blood trails revealing where he was headed to. Frank, bleeding from his stomach, entered an abandoned and quiet mansion, believing no one would be present inside. After a while, Frank is surprised to see a mysterious man in a dark room, who kept looking out of the window. Unbeknownst to him, it was Rai, who would soon become his master. Mistaking Rai for another servant, Frank believes Rai is a new butler at the mansion. Jejuval and Rager notify Rai of the Lord's request to see Frank. Rai officially makes Frank his servant, astonishingly turning away noble clan leaders. And meanwhile, Frank continues intense training under Rager's supervision. But Jejuval remains adamant about apprehending Frank for tarnishing Rai's name. Frank, obedient to Rai, heads to meet the Lord, but he senses hatred from nobles as he makes his way to the throne room. The Lord reveals Rai's isolation and suggests a blood pact with Frank to increase his lifespan. Frank, hesitant to serve nobles, is reminded of his half-decade with Rai. The Lord views Rai as essential for the nobility's protection. However, Frank mocks the Lord's views, suggesting abolishing the system. Intrigued, the Lord leaves Rai in Frank's care. After the meeting, nobles gossip about the Lord's suggestion of a blood pact between Rai and Frank. Yurikai grows visibly angry. Later, while carrying out chores, Frank invites Jejidal to spar. Yurikai, angered by Frank's acceptance by Rai, duels him. Frank restrains his power, but Yurikai provokes him, leading to Frank manifesting a demonic form. Rai and the Lord arrive, and Rai uses their blood to bring Frank back to his senses. Frank, bandaged and back at Rai's mansion, decides to form a blood contract with Rai. Both agree to the pact, and Frank vows loyalty. In the present, Jejidal regrets allowing the contract. He tries to convince Frank to bring Rai back to Lucadonia to prove his innocence, but Frank refuses, highlighting Rai's positive change. Jejidal realizes Rai is content and departs, meeting Regis and Sarah. Returning to Lucadonia, Jejidal informs Raskrea that Rai's friends mistook someone else for him. Doubting his words, Raskrea attempts to read Jejidal's mind, leading to his imprisonment. Rail offers to retrieve Sarah, and Raskrea entrusts him with the task. Arriving in Japan, Rail rushes to Sarah's high school, leaping between buildings. He uses mind control to clear the sports field, alerting Sarah, Regis, and Rai to a powerful noble's presence. Sensing trouble, Tao, Takio, and M21 hurry to the rooftop, finding Rail, who insults them as humans. Ignoring Regis's inquiry, Rail describes his love for Sarah, revealing a past proposal. Rail violently attacks M21 until Regis and Sarah intervene. Sarah demands Rail leave, who reluctantly agrees, whispering a threat to Sarah before departing. Regis questions the whisper, but M21 collapses from injuries, prompting urgency. Hurrying M21 to Frank, he's placed in a regenerating pod. Regis explains Rail's immense strength as a Kersha pureblood. Regis discloses Rail's motive to take Sarah back to Lucadonia, leading to questions about a past proposal. Sarah reveals Rail proposed years ago, resulting in his confinement for going berserk after rejection. Tao and Takio request experiments from Frank for strength. At night, Sarah calms a worried Regis on the balcony, surprising him with a comforting gesture. She advises him to sleep, sneaking out alone later to meet Rail. Frank seeks Rai's permission to deal with Rail, receiving approval as Rai lifts the seal on his powers. Meanwhile, Rail eagerly awaits Sarah, only to face rejection again. Enraged, he prepares to attack when Frank intervenes. A fierce battle ensues, revealing Rail's sole weapon, Grandia, surprising Sarah. The fight intensifies, and Frank provokes Rail to use his full potential. Rail reveals the Lord's command, forcing Sarah to comply or face treason. Regis pleads to accompany Sarah, but Rail declines, citing the Lord's orders. Taking Sarah to Lucadonia, Rail laughs, revealing Jejidal's dire situation due to his lie. Helpless, Frank and Regis return to the mansion, informing Rai about Sarah and Jejidal. After Rai decides to rescue them, Frank and Regis prepare to go to Lucadonia. Meanwhile, at Raskrea's palace, she anticipates the day she'll confront Rai, seeking revenge for her father's death. Sarah, accompanied by Rail, enters the throne room for questioning. Just then, Raskrea reveals that Jejidal is imprisoned for false reports. Seeking the truth, Raskrea probes Sarah about meeting a suspected noble while blending with humans. Unable to give a clear answer, Raskrea attempts to read Sarah's mind, causing Sarah to shriek in pain. Rail defends Sarah, revealing they only encountered modified humans and a strong blonde human. So Raskrea orders Sarah's confinement for hesitating. Rai, Regis, and Frank board a jet to Lucadonia to aid Sarah and Jejidal. Frank assures Regis about the modified humans' preparedness, and they crash land the jet in Lucadonia's sea, planning to reach Rai's mansion. The clan leaders discover Sarah and Jejidal's arrest and learn of the jet crash. Ludis suggests sending knights to investigate. In Lucadonia, Rai, Regis, and Frank enter a forbidden forest from where Rai's mansion lies nearby. After crash landing, they sense a mysterious aura and find the previous lord's sole weapon, Ragnarok. Regis guards as Rai investigates. Meanwhile, disguised, Regis faces approaching knights, but he is betrayed when his mask falls. However, the modified humans rescue him, revealing they followed him secretly. Rai admits responsibility for Sarah and Jejidal's plight. Rai clarifies he's accused of the previous lord's death, not being a noble. M21 questions Rai's noblest status. Frank explains Rai's unmatched power, surprising Regis and modified humans. Despite rumors, they support Rai. Rai recalls the previous lord predicting Rai's future companions. Rai heads to the sanctuary to meet Raskrea. Knights inform Raskrea of Regis's betrayal, reinforcing her belief in Rai's support. She considers punishing Jejidal with eternal sleep but grants him a chance to explain. Raskrea recalls her past jealousy of Rai, revealed by Jejidal. In the present, she demands Jejidal's allegiance. Jejidal admits meeting Rai in Japan. Raskrea spares him but strips his leadership, preparing for his eternal sleep. Raskrea tasks Rajak and Kadis to apprehend Rai's group, blaming Rai for her father's death. Sarah, learning of Jejidal's fate, breaks out of her cell in retaliation. Back to Rai, Regis along with M21 make their way through the forest of Lucadonia towards the Lord's palace, since they had to act as bait for Rai and Frank so that they could reach the palace easily. As Regis and M21 make their way, they get interrupted by Rael, who lands in front of the two of them. Back at the Lord's palace, Sarah makes her way to Jejidal, but she gets interrupted by Rosaria, the leader of the Eleanor clan, who stands in her way. Rosaria, reminding her that she was committing treason, orders her to return back to her cell, but Sarah refuses to do so, and moments later, a battle between them ensues. Meanwhile, after Regis hears that his grandfather, Jejidal, was being forced to eternal sleep, he hurries to save Jejidal as M21 assures him that he can take out Rael. Tao and Takio, following them from behind, also assure Regis that they were capable of dealing with Rael as they had the T2 pill that Frank handed them. Without a second to waste, Regis hurries to save Sarah and Jejidal, whereas Rael gets pissed off after he starts to bleed, which leads to him losing his mind and making him berserk. Back at the Lord's palace, Sarah unleashes her soul weapon, Death Scythe, to which in response, Rosaria summons her soul weapon, Blood Witch, as they both engage in a fierce battle. From afar, Kadis and Rajak notice Regis sprinting towards the Lord's palace. To stop Regis, Kadis holds Rajak back and decides that he will be going in to stop Regis. Meanwhile, back at the battle between Rael and the modified humans, in order for Takio's bullets to hit Rael, Tao tells M21 to lure Rael closer to them. M21, being a master at provocation, provokes Rael to get closer, which Rael does and eventually falls into a trap Tao and Takio had set up for him. As Rael stepped closer, Takio's bullets started to emit high-voltage shocks that Tao had planted into Takio's bullets, which electrocuted Rael, causing him to go even more berserk. As Rael broke free from the trap, Rael summoned his soul weapon, Grandias, in an attempt to eliminate the modified humans once and for all. Witnessing the Grandias summon from afar, Frank starts to worry for the modified humans as he leaves, with the permission of his master, Rai, to protect them from Rael. Meanwhile, Kadis catches up with Regis and, as they were on good terms, advises him to leave Lucadonia for the time being. Refusing to show cowardice, Regis stands his ground and tells Kadis that he will accompany Jejidal no matter what. Seeing Regis's conviction, Kadis challenges Regis to get past him as he tells Regis that if he even grazes him a bit, he will aid him in reaching the Lord's palace. Kadis thrashes Regis and suggests he reconsider his decisions. However, Regis rises each time trying to fight back Kadis. Back at the fight between Rael and the modified humans, Rael, now with his soul weapon, Grandias, is able to flip the board as he toys with M21 and is able to deflect Takio and Tao's attacks easily. After toying with M21, Rael prepares to toy with Tao and Takio, but he is stopped as M21 holds onto his leg and calls him a fake noble. Enraged, Rael is moments away from ending M21's life, but he is interrupted by his brother, Rajak, who appears and warns Rael of Frank, who had also appeared to protect the modified humans. Frank lets them know that Ragar, the previous leader of Kersha, was on equal footing with him. Realizing this, Rajak decides to take him seriously and summons his soul weapon. Likewise, Frank summons his dark spear and clashes against Rajak. Meanwhile, at her father's coffin, Raskrea offers her respects and vows to fight off Rai relentlessly as her father had made the mistake of trusting him. She orders Ludis to bring Jejidal to her and calls Rosaria to her through telepathy. Back at the battlefield, Frank defends himself as Rajak pushes on with his speed. Rajak then forms many duplicates and advances towards Frank, who uses his spear to cut all of the duplicates down. Seeing the modified humans cheering for Frank, Rael throws a slash towards them. Frank stops Rael's slash, only to be taken off guard by Rajak. As a man of honor, Rajak also wounds himself to keep the battle between him and Frank fair. Meanwhile, Regis falls down from bleeding, but Kadis holds him. Reminding him to keep his word, Regis lands a light punch on Kadis's body, who is proud of his conviction. Back at her palace, Raskrea sentences Sarah to eternal sleep as she had protected Jejidal. Jejidal once again pleads Rai and Sarah's innocence, but Raskrea does not hear him out. Jejidal reminds Raskrea that sentencing Rai would be impossible as Frank, the only powerful human to be acknowledged by the previous lord, was by his side. At the battlefield, Frank exhausts Rajak and then wounds him. Seeing his brother lose, Rael tries to hand his soul weapon to Rajak so he could fuse his own soul weapon with it, but Rajak scolds him instead. Their father, Ragnar, had divided his own soul weapon and had given Rajak and Rael each piece, which was against the nobility rules. Hearing Rael wanting to fuse the pieces of the soul weapon, effectively undoing their father's wish, makes Rajak angry at Rael. Meanwhile, at his sentencing, Jedidal continues to point out Raskrea's lack of understanding regarding Frank and Rai's past, as he calls her unfit to be lord. Jedidal informs the present clan leaders of the real reason for Raskrea's hate towards Rai. All of them are shocked to learn from Jedidal about the previous lord's suggestion to make Rai the next lord instead of Raskrea, which stemmed Raskrea's hate for Rai. Moreover, Jedidal points out that Raskrea had made no effort to learn any reasons for Rai's refusal to become the next lord. Bewildered to hear him badmouth the lord, the other clan leaders respectfully ask Jedidal to be silent. Raskrea summons the Ragnarok and heads towards Jedidal to put him in eternal sleep. Suddenly, as Raskrea was about to punish Jedidal and Sarah, Rai appeared from the main entrance in order to save them from their punishments. Approaching Raskrea, Rai is stopped by Kru, the Ru clan leader, as he summons his soul weapon, Garant. K uses his strongest attacks at Rai, but it has no effect on him as Rai, immediately after parrying his attacks, easily lifts him up and throws him away. Rosaria, the leader of the Eleanor clan, quickly follows up by summoning her soul weapon, Blood Witch, which also ends up useless as Rai is easily able to deflect all of her attacks as well. To protect the queen from the deflected projectiles, Ludis Murgas, leader of the Murgas clan, uses his soul weapon, Izanork, to block the incoming attacks. Rosaria, unable to defend herself from her own attacks, falls to the ground as Ludis Murgas takes her place and uses Izanork over Rai to shrink until Rai is squished. Tired by the clan leader's futile attempts, Rai uses his mind control to force the leaders to fall to the ground due to the sheer power of the mind control. Sarah, surprised by seeing someone other than a lord control the minds of the clan leaders, inquires about Rai's true power. Jedidal reveals that Rai was a noblesse, which meant that he had power surpassing those of lords, and noblesse such as him were appointed to protect as well as punish lords. Witnessing the clan leaders succumb to Rai's mind control, Raskrea enters the battle as she, with her soul weapon, Ragnarok, creates a whirlpool of blood that had an immensely strong aura. Feeling the abnormally strong aura of the lord's weapon, from Frank and his men to the clan leaders, all of them stop fighting and hurry to the lord's palace. Back at the palace, Rai, being the noblesse, is able to parry the strong attack from Raskrea, and he sends her flying to the roof. Rai, upon sensing that she wasn't using her full potential, provokes her to use the blood field, which was an attack only the noblesse and the noble lords could perform. Provoked on using the blood field, Raskrea goes all out, but it all is in vain as Rai, once again, nullifies her strongest attack. Hopeless, Raskrea falls to the ground as she cries over how she lost to him once again since her father, the previous lord, had initially chosen Rai instead of her to become the lord. Seeing Raskrea in such a vulnerable state, the clan leaders stand up once again in order to protect Raskrea and her honor. Rai, seeing their conviction to protect Raskrea, tells them that it was all useless as they would keep on losing to him unless Raskrea does not properly master the blood field. Ignoring Rai's words, they all gang up on Rai, which proves Rai true as they once again get humbled by Rai's OP power. After a while, bored from the fight, Rai decides to use blood field on the clan leaders as he begins to accumulate blood from the ground, causing the air to get dark red. To protect the clan leaders, Raskrea jumps in front of them and uses her blood field to nullify Rai's blood field. After going overboard and using blood field, Rai and Raskrea fall due to exhaustion. To save Rai from hitting himself to the ground, Frank catches Rai whereas Kru grabs onto the falling Raskrea. Along with Frank, Rael, Rajak and the superhumans who were fighting outside the palace enter the palace, and they all witness as Rai uses his hand to summon another Ragnarok. Surprised to see two Ragnaroks present, the other Ragnarok starts to glow, which causes Raskrea's Ragnarok to rise up and project the previous lord's residual thought. The previous lord reveals that he had willingly chosen to end his own life by putting himself to an eternal sleep. Furthermore, he adds that in order to evolve, he had to entrust the future generation with Lucadonia's future, thus he, along with some of the senior clan leaders, willingly ended their own lives. Jedidal, being amongst the ones who stepped up to end his life alongside the lord, was sent back by the previous lord to watch after the future generation. After learning Jedidal's truth, the clan leaders ask about why he hadn't told them the truth. In response, Jedidal reveals that he held back after seeing how young successors were abruptly thrusted into the spotlight to fill in the shoes of their predecessors. Adding on, Jedidal reveals that since every successor was confused due to the sudden role shift, someone took advantage and spread rumors about Rai being a traitor. Embarrassed at not being able to fulfill the previous lord's order, Jedidal requests Raskrea to punish him for not being incapable of telling them the truth. Before Raskrea announced her punishment, Cadis throws Regis in front of Jedidal on Regis's request as he requests Raskrea to be punished as well since he belonged to Jedidal's clan. The clan leaders, after seeing Regis's potential, request the Raskrea to not punish him since he had potential to lead the Landegger clan in the coming future. Hearing the thoughts of the clan leaders, Raskrea frees Jegital and Sarah as she hugs and thanks Jegital for always being by her side. Shortly after, the previous lord's residual disappears after he apologizes to Raskrea for not letting her know of his death. As the residual disappeared, the two Ragnaroks merge into each other, forming a single strong Ragnarok which Rai hands over to Raskrea since the Ragnarok was made for the noble lords. The next day, after the superhumans healed, Frank gets the permission from Raskrea to take Regis and Sarah back to Japan along with them. Meanwhile, Rai outside the Lord's palace meets up with Raskrea, who asks him about how his father was. Rai, having good memories with his father, tells her that his father was always proud of her, which cracks up Raskrea as she laughs in happiness. After a while, Rai, along with Frank, Regis, Sarah and the superhumans, leave Lucadonia to head back to Japan. Upon reaching Japan, everybody's routine returns back to normal as Toshiro and Manabu meet up with all of them, making them realize how good their lives had gotten during their time in Japan with humans.